Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are strapping in for what the sources are calling, well, nothing less than a political earthquake in the United Kingdom. We've analyzed a stack of commentary, polling data, strategic analysis, and it suggests the established political structure, the one from the last century. It's not just wobbling.
No, it's actively collapsing. That's the picture emerging.
So this deep dive is really about that fundamental realignment of UK politics, moving way beyond the old two-party system we're used to.
That's absolutely right. And our mission today really is thoroughly dissect this material. Paints a picture of rising ideology.
Right.
We're looking at the competing strategies, the core policy pillars of these, let's call them emerging force. What the commentary labels the post-woke left, and then the surging, pretty uncompromising radical right, mostly embodied by the...
And the core observation, the big takeaway we're getting from the source material, it's dramatic. It's basically that the center cannot hold. The old parties, they're described as just withering away, creating this massive vacuum.
And that void is being filled by forces pushing really radical, uncompromising agendas.
Yeah, we're seeing these radical right and radical left forces gaining ground incredibly fast. It feels like a much more volatile, uncertain, maybe even revolutionary political era starting.
Well, and we have to stress this analysis, it isn't just abstract theory, is it?
No, not at all.
We're using data from recent polling projections, detailed political commentary. It focuses on the tactical shift of these emerging figures. Nigel Farage on the right, influential radical left figures like Zach Polansky from the Greens.
So it's a snapshot of a political system under huge, maybe even terminal stress.
Precisely. And this deep dive, it's our shortcut to understanding what these radical factions actually, and maybe more importantly, how their strategies, the right and the left, are sort of converging and diverging.
Right.
Where do they agree? Where do they fight?
Okay, let's start there. Let's define this fascinating strategic entity. The post-woke left, PWL, the name itself, post-woke. It kind of suggests they're moving past the culture wars, but the sources argue, well, the opposite.
Exactly. It's not a retraction. The sources frame it as an evolution.
An evolution. How so?
The post-woke left, as defined in this material, is basically the wing of the left that now sees wokeism, the whole suite of cultural identity politics, as settled, as the correct, non-negotiable way of seeing the liberal order.
Okay, so they've absorbed it completely.
Yeah, they've absorbed the worldview. Trans rights, mass immigration, modern feminist ideas, systematic oppression narratives, all of that.
So if they've accepted those principles, they don't need to be on this constant sort of aggressive ideological crusade anymore.
Right.
To enforce it within their own circles.
That seems to be the insight. It's just their default operating system now.
Right.
Wokeism as that constant fever pitch campaign. The sources see that as having peaked maybe around 2020. Now it's just settled into the core identity of the left. But, and this is crucial, the PWL understands a key tactical weakness.
Which is?
These cultural prescriptions. They just don't have mass public appeal. They know campaigning only on those things limits their reach. Maybe 15%, 20% of the electorate, tops.
And that realization, well, it forces the strategic pivot, doesn't it? If the cultural battlegrounds aren't winning you the masses, you need something else.
You have to find a new unifying theme, something that resonates with more people, especially when times are tough, like they are now.
Which leads them to?
Exactly. The source commentary really highlights this. The PWL is pivoting its strategy heavily towards wealth taxes and the politics of class hatred.
Okay.
They recognize that public skepticism is still pretty high on issues like, say, trans identity or the claims of movements like Black Lives Matter. But there's almost universal agreement that things, economically, structurally...
That general feeling of malaise, it creates a perfect target, doesn't it?
It does.
Instead of asking people to agree on complex cultural stuff, get them to agree on who's to blame for the economic pain.
And the easiest target is always the rich or the billionaires. It's much easier than confronting the deep structural complexities of why...
Like, say, the pressure on public services from rapid population growth or falling productivity, things like that.
Exactly. Those are harder conversations. It's simpler to blame billionaires. Figures like Zach Polansky are described as pushing this core, talking every single problem in the country directly caused by the existence of billions.
That focus on resentment. And it's strategically powerful when services are failing and wages aren't keeping.
And the success of this pivot, it's tied directly to the failure of the old party conservatives and labor to deal with this public. The commentary on the collapse of the center, well, it's staggering.
It really is. Let's dig into that. How bad is it for them, according to the sources?
It's a diagnosis of political mortality, frankly. The Conservative Party is labeled quite bluntly as a dead party.
Dead.
Yeah, rooted in a past paradigm, they say. A party of the 19th, 20th centuries whose time has just passed. Their failure to address the core concerns of that nativist vote means they're splitting the right, paving the way for reform.
Okay, so the Tories are dead. What about Labor? Historically, they're the ones who benefit when the Conservatives fail.
Well, Labor's also called a 20th century party, but their crisis is different. The sources say they're being chewed out by the Greens.
Chewed out by the Greens.
Yeah, and the polling cited, it's historically dramatic. It shows Labor potentially falling as low as 15% of the national vote.
15%. We really need to pause on that figure. For Labor, one of the two traditional pillars, how unprecedented is 15%?
It's utterly seismic. I mean, even in their worst historical moments, they held on to much higher support. Think about the 1931 wipeout. Even then, Labor got nearly 30% of the vote. Falling to 15% national, that puts them in fourth, or maybe joint third with the Green. The source material stresses this isn't just a dip. It represents a total desertion by their traditional working class.
And losing their newer ethnic constituencies, too.
Exactly, losing them to the...
So if these polls actually happen in a general election, the parliamentary wipeout would just shatter both major parties.
The projections are incredibly grim for the establishment, The Conservatives projected down to maybe 24, a devastating loss, the kind not seen since, the turn of the previous...
And Labor, even if they're polling 15% national, how does that translate to seats?
Catastrophically bad for them, too. Maybe down to 17. The commentary blames Labor's failure on trying to serve too many...
How so?
Well, they abandoned their core base with the Blairite project, right? But then they tried, and apparently failed, to satisfy the radical cultural demands of their newer, often foreign, constituents. And those constituents are now migrating wholesale to the Green.
So the message is crystal clear. The center is dissolved, and the only beneficiary are these radical forces on either side.
That's the takeaway, a complete shattering of the old order.
Okay, if the center is dissolving, let's look at the radical right, mainly Reform. They seem to be soaring in this analysis. What's their core political mandate, according to the source?
Reform is positioned pretty unambiguously. They represent the solid native. They embody that public demand for aggressive, uncompromising right-wing politics designed to fundamentally fix what people see as a broken.
Right.
And crucially, the sources note, this brand is so strong, even if Nigel Farage himself doesn't personally buy into every single aspect of, say, radical online right-wing thinking, the opposition labels him with it, and he gets to own that narrative. He becomes the uncompromising voice against the established census.
And the polling projections, the source material models, they're not just big, they're genuinely staggering. They suggest Reform isn't just aiming to win, but to get this massive majority that would just reshape the British political system overnight.
The data analysis suggests an incredible, something unprecedented in modern political history. Projecting Reform could get as many as 390 seats.
390.
And they only need 326 for a working majority. Now, this projection, it's high, obviously, but it's based on them successfully consolidating that right-wing vote while the opposition splintered.
Let's unpack the implications of that. A 390-seat Reform majority led by Nigel Farage. The source material uses some very dramatic language here.
It does. The analysis says such a mandate would grant Farage effectively dictatorial powers over the country for that parliamentary term.
Dictatorial powers, that's strong.
It is, and we have to be clear, this is the source commentary's interpretation of the immense power that comes with such a landslide. It's not objective fact, it's their analysis of it.
Okay.
But the implication is huge, because this majority, it would be mostly brand new MPs, many with no previous parliamentary experience at all, elected purely on the Reform Manifesto and Farage's personal...
So, in that scenario, these new MPs, they wouldn't have any loyalty to old parliamentary traditions or institutions. They're just there to execute the plan.
That's the fear of the establishment, and it's the promise to the voter, isn't it? The source material suggests they could just rush through any agenda, destroy everything the establishment holds dear.
Which means?
Dismantling current progressive laws, bureaucratic structures, that kind of thing. Now, obviously, there'd be massive, sustained opposition from the civil service, the media, various institutions.
And the blob.
Right, the blob. But the suggestion from the commentary is Farage should just ignore them. Use his 5 years to fundamentally reshape the system, take the fight directly to...
The commentary even gives a practical, sort of symbolic example. Something Farage should do on day one to show this power, deliver a small, believable win immediately.
Yes. The example they cite is getting rid of the new requirement for digital IDs to buy alcohol in pubs.
Ah, okay. That policy.
Yeah. Seen by the right as a step towards Pointless government overreach, surveillance. It's a perfect, easy target. The suggestion is pledge to scrap that rule on day one, show immediate, decisive action against bureaucratic, prove the mandate is real and instantly actionable.
Okay, so under this truly radical scenario, reform with 390 seats, who's left to actually challenge them? Who forms the opposition?
Well, this is where it gets interesting again. The analysis projects the Liberal Democrats would win around 80 seats, making them, remarkably, His Majesty's loyal opposition.
The Lib Dems.
Yeah.
As the main opposition. That's a huge jump for them.
A substantial increase, yes. The sources argue the Lib Dems have successfully appealed to quite specific demographics.
Which are?
Middle-class white English areas. They're described as the party of Middle England.
Okay, but why would the Lib Dem platform suddenly resonate there while the conservatives are being annihilated? What's the difference?
They campaign on what the source material calls the libtard status quo.
Okay, unpack that term for us based on the source's definition.
It's defined as progressive non-intervention. So basically, they promise not to rock the boat with radical social laws, but they also clearly position themselves with a plan for rejoining the EU, upholding international liberal norms.
Right.
They appeal to an established, generally well-off white English demographic, people who want stability, low cultural disruption, progressivism, maybe, but without the threat of the high taxes being pushed. Well.
Okay. And meanwhile, the radical left's main electoral success is projected through the Green Party, but their success is very constant.
Yes. The Greens are projected to win around 56, and the commentary is very specific about where that success is constant.
Where?
In areas undergoing what the sources term ethnic replacement. Now, we have to address the highly inflammatory language used here by the source material. It's important we're clear this is their framing.
Absolutely. What is the framing?
The commentary describes the Green Party under Zach Polanski as essentially an Islam communist alliance.
This extremely aggressive language.
Yeah.
What specific elements do the sources point to that lead them to use such a label beyond just the ethnic makeup of the voters? We need to report their reasoning without endorsing it.
Absolutely. The source material argues the label comes from the fact that the party's growing support is concentrated in areas where traditional labor voters have been supplanted by new ethnic communities, mainly Muslim.
Okay.
And these communities, the argument goes, have merged interests with the radical left's anti-capitalist, pro-redistribution, and pro-immigrant agenda. The political equation, according to the source, is labor failed these ethnic constituents,
Right.
who are now moving directly to creating these geographically separate ethnic and ideological enclaves that reflect, in the source's view, a communist political.
Regardless of the label the commentary uses, the polling jump for the Greens is still notable in itself.
Oh, it's impressive for them up to 15% nationally at time polls. The commentator doubts they can grow much beyond that. Suspects the wider public can sort of smell a rat about the party's underlying communist leanings, as they put it. But the consequence is clear. Labor is being cannibalized, and the main argument in the rest of the country becomes a battle between Reform's radical nativism and the Lib Dems' progressive pro-stability.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. We established the post-woke left is pivoting to economic critique. What's fascinating here is the sources highlight a genuine economic problem that, they argue, both the radical left and the radical right should agree on.
Yes, the failures of privatization.
Right.
And this point is strategically vital for the radical right's platform, of course. The PWL is successfully tapping into public anger over the perceived failure and the sheer cost of privatized services.
And the analysis we're looking at strongly agrees with the left on this specific.
It does. It calls privatization a failed experiment, one that's cost the country dearly. In terms of investment, lost revenue, just a bad deal all around.
We need to get a sense of the scale here, this financial drain. How much money are we talking about leaving the public sector through these privatized utilities?
Figure cited is pretty stunning. An estimated $200 billion paid out to shareholders.
$100 billion.
Yeah, for privatized utilities, that covers vital stuff. Rail, mail, energy, buses over decades. The core argument is simple, that money should have stayed in the public purse.
Right, invested in modernizing infrastructure maybe, or used to cut customer bills.
Exactly. Instead, it was systematically siphoned out as shareholder profit. That's the narrative.
Let's use Royal Mail as a specific example, because that illustrates the transfer of a highly profitable asset, right?
Precisely. When Royal Mail was privatized back in 2013, it wasn't some struggling institution needing rescue.
No, it was making money.
A lot of money. The data shows it was highly profitable. Turnover of $9.3 billion, generating a substantial $324 million in profit.
Wow.
The commentary views that transaction explicitly as selling off a profitable national asset, £250 million going into the exchequer every year, to what the source material describes, very pointed, as conservative ally donor Fact.
So the narrative the left successfully spin, and that the right, according to this analysis, must acknowledge, is that this wasn't about economic efficiency. It was a deliberate wealth transfer to politically connected donors. We should note, again, this is the highly partisan framing presented by the commentary, highlighting the distrust around these sales.
Precisely. That's the framing. The core accusation is the goal wasn't efficiency. It was handing over existing, functioning, profitable national institutions to political allies who could then maximize profit, often by cutting services or underinvesting.
And the right-wing analysis in the source material agrees that this critique focused on cronyism, misplaced ideology, actually has some truth.
It does hold genuine truth, yes. That's the assessment.
And this problem extends into really crucial areas too, like social care, where profits are being extracted from highly vulnerable services.
Social care is described as a fiscal black hole for local authority. The analysis highlights that nearly a quarter of foster placements, children's residential homes, they're run by companies backed by private equity.
Right. And their motive is profit.
Explicit. These firms are set up to seek extremely high profit margins, 20% or more, which makes essential social services hugely expensive for local councils. And critically, the money isn't going to improve care or raise workers.
It's going to private equity profits.
Straight into private equity profits, diverted away.
And the railway system that provides maybe the most potent example of privatization failure because of the foreign state ownership act.
This is a major point of strategic between the left's anti-exploitation argument and the right's native. The UK is said to have some of the worst, most expensive trains in Europe.
Yeah, we hear that a lot.
And the unique, very specific reason given here is that roughly half of the networks are owned by foreign state rail.
Foreign governments running UK trains.
Yes. This isn't standard private enterprise. This is foreign governments running essential UK infrastructure.
Can you list some of the examples the sources give? It almost sounds satirical.
Well, we're apparently paying subsidies and providing revenue to the Italian state railways they own West Coast. The Dutch state railways own Greater Anglia and East Midlands Railway. The German state railways own Cross Country. Even the Hong Kong government partially owns Southwestern Railway.
So the commentary emphasizes that the UK is literally paying foreign governments to run our own core infrastructure.
That's the point being hammered home.
Why is this seen as such a massive failure from a national perspective, beyond just the trains being bad or expensive?
The commentary argues it's a direct form of economic. We are effectively subsidizing European rail systems with the profits made here in the UK.
Right.
Plus, the system is designed badly. It's cheaper for these foreign operators to just pay fines for poor service than to actually invest capital and improve things for British customers.
Which leads to this critical observation in the analysis. There is no right-wing argument for allowing this situation to continue.
The radical right, grounded in national interest, property rights, they should fundamentally oppose this. The argument is these services, rail, water, energy, they're natural monopoly, real competition possible.
Okay.
So allowing foreign governments to extract profits from strategic national monopoly, it's seen as ideological insanity.
Yeah.
And in the strong terms used by the source material, a betrayal by previous conservative governments who put blind ideology ahead of the national.
So the economic critique of privatization is a shared pillar, but the underlying motivation is very different. The left sees it as class warfare,
Yes.
while the right frames it as national exploitation that demands a defense of national sovereignty.
Exactly. And the radical right can strategically argue these services should return to public ownership. Not because we're but for reasons of national fiscal responsibility.
To reduce the tax.
Right, because profits would go to the exchequer, not foreign states, and to end the systematic exploitation of the British public by these foreign entities. It's a nationalist argument, not a social.
Okay, let's move to the broader economic context. Both sides are proposing pretty radical solutions to the UK's deep fiscal crisis. Before we get to their proposal, we need to set the stage. The UK is under immense fiscal strain already.
It absolutely is. The sources keep noting this. The UK currently carries the highest tax burden
Since World War II.
Yeah, and it's important to remember what that means. That previous high point was when the nation was running a literal command economy because of the war.
Right, a totally different situation.
Totally different. Yet, despite this already high baseline, the PWL is pushing for even higher tax and wealth conflict.
What's their main justification for demanding more wealth taxes in an economy that's already stagnant and highly taxed?
Well, an economist cited in the sources, apparently often on LBC, uses Spain as the model.
Why Spain?
He argues Spain has a higher overall tax rate, they introduced a wealth tax, and yet they're the fastest growing economy in Europe, citing the economy. The claim is, this proves you can have strong growth and high taxes and more redistribution.
Okay, that sounds compelling on the surface, but let's use the data in our analysis to test that comparison. Is there really substantial room for the UK to raise taxes to match Spain's spending level?
The counter-analysis immediately says the comparison is because the UK and Spain, they're already almost at parity in government spending relative. Spain's expenditure is cited at 45.06%.
Okay.
While the UK's is currently 44%.
Wait a second. If the UK government is spending nearly the same percentage of national wealth as Spain, why does the PWL argument suggest we have lots of room to raise taxes?
Yeah.
Is the UK just dramatically less efficient with its spending? Is that the implication?
Yeah, that seems... The sources conclude that if the UK did raise taxes to match Spain, it would only be a marginal... It wouldn't offer much real fiscal, given Britain's massive deficit stagnant. The problem isn't necessarily the percentage of... It's that the UK is spending similar amounts but getting worse outcome, probably due to economic stagnation and the massive cost of its high welfare spend, which is made worse by things like rapid mass immigration.
So the comparison is essentially it's appealing to emotional politics, not fiscal reality. Because the UK's structural economic problems are much deeper than just tweaking the top tax rate.
Exactly. The sources conclude there's very little substantive room for tax increases that wouldn't just further cripple economic growth. It highlights the PWL asserting feelings, resentment over rational fiscal policy.
This brings us to the most radical economic proposal from the left, the one that really shows the depth of their anti-capitalist feeling, the 100% inheritance tax idea.
Yeah, figures like Lewis Goodall, other radical left voices, they've openly proposed a 100% inheritance tax on estates over a certain threshold, say 10 million pounds.
How do they frame it?
They frame it as a moral imperative, justified by a supposed belief in meritocracy. And they say it's merely returning the money to the state where they believe it rightfully belongs anyway.
100%.
Yeah.
That is economically radical beyond almost anything in modern Western politics.
Yeah.
The response from the right-wing commentary must be pretty visceral. They label it
Outright theft. That's the label. Outright theft and economically insane.
Okay.
The fundamental objection raised in the sources is ethical. This money was earned by someone taxed already at every stage, income tax, capital gains tax.
All right.
And it should be passed on according to the deceased's wishes. Property rights, family obligations, confiscating it violates core principles of a functioning society. That's the argument.
Let's put the economic impact of this. Well, this radical theft, as the source calls it, into perspective relative to the UK's massive fiscal black hole, particularly the cost of the NHS.
The analysis runs the numbers based on wealth projections. If the government somehow managed to raise, say, 70 billion to 80 billion by taxing all the wealthy people in Britain at 100%, which is probably optimistic.
Okay.
That amount would only cover about 6 months of NHS spending.
6 months. Just 6 months of NHS spending. That fact alone is crucial, isn't it? It really illustrates the futility of this class warfare approach to funding.
It does. The national deficit is currently cited around 137 billion pounds, a 5% to 10% deficit. The PWL's grand wealth grab barely covers half of that, let alone the total annual public sector spending, which is 1.2 trillion.
It just highlights the problem is systemic, colossal. Stealing all the wealth, as the source puts it, barely covers the deficit for 1 year, never mind the ongoing systemic spending demands. The wealth of the rich just isn't enough to sustain the welfare state at its current size.
Exactly.
And the immediate economic consequence of such an extreme tax, it's obvious, predictable capital flight.
Does the source material offer any credible defense for how they'd stop a complete economic collapse if this policy came in? No, they don't. The advocates are accused of just willfully ignoring the critical reality. Wealthy people are mobile, geographically mobile.
They can just leave.
They can just leave. The sources emphasize the top 1% of earners pay 30% of the country's total tax. Total receipts are 1.12 trillion. If you threaten them with 100% tax, they will leave. They'll go to Dubai, Singapore, New York, competing financial centers.
And letting them go, which some radical figures have actually suggested, would just cripple tax receipts, collapse public services.
The commentary suggests this flight of millions of high-value individuals could cause a loss of maybe a third of the tax. Receipts dropping from 1.12 trillion down to maybe 800 billion overnight.
Wow.
The money needed for the NHS, pensions, welfare, it just vanished. Now, a communist might want the economic system to collapse, to force a radical restructuring, but the immediate consequence, the welfare state collapse, public service, the most vulnerable suffer.
So the PWL's pivot to class hatred, tactically useful for stirring resentment, maybe, but it rests on an economically ruinous, demonstrably insufficient policy for actually solving the national deficit.
It reveals, according to the sources, a profound lack of economic literacy, prioritizing emotional, ideological hostility over rational, sustainable state funding, a core disconnect between their ideological goals and the operational reality of managing a trillion-pound public sector.
Okay, let's turn to the cultural divide. We established the PWL tries to avoid debating cultural issues directly on the campaign trail, but the source material is clear. These issues define their fundamental belief, and immigration is central to that worldview.
Yes, and the language used is pretty unambiguous. For figures like Zach Polanski, immigration is explicitly called Britain's superpower.
Britain's superpower.
Yeah. And this position is paired with the argument that any fears about immigration, they're intentionally manufactured by the existing power structure.
Manufactured by whom and why?
The PWL argues these fears are spread by the elites that own us, specifically capitalists and billionaires. They need someone to blame immigrants for underlying problems like wage compression, housing shortage.
Right. But the right-wing counter-analysis in the source material argues the opposite, doesn't it? That the super rich actually want mass immigration.
Exactly. Because it provides an endless supply of cheap labor, suppresses wage, which actually exacerbates wealth inequality, benefiting the employer. Two totally opposing views on who benefits.
This cultural commitment to mass immigration is apparently so deep that the sources suggest the left's mask slips sometimes through their rhetoric, particularly their use of poetry, revealing their true intentions for cultural transformation.
The analysis points to two key poems used by the left that illustrate this perspective, and the sources interpret this rhetoric as actively promoting the displacement of the native English and British people from their ancient native home, a concept, they argue, the left actually celebrates.
Okay, let's look at the first example. Louise Bennett's poem from 1966, Colonization in Reverse. What does the commentary focus on?
The commentary highlights that this poem explicitly celebrates Jamaican immigrants coming to England and, quote, colonizing England in reverse.
Colonizing England in reverse.
Yeah. The poem describes people packing bags to settle in demotherland and turn history upside down by reversing the colonial flow. The source material interprets this as an explicit, open admission that the immigrants see their movement as a form of colonization of the UK, often motivated, they suggest, by the belief they'll benefit financially from the generous wealth. It's presented as a declaration of intent for cultural transformation.
Okay. The second example, Benjamin Zephaniah's poem, British. This one was read by Green Party leaders, and it frames Britain as a melting pot recipe. That sounds more like an attempt to define a new composite national identity.
Well, the poem describes the historical mixing of indigenous groups, Celts, Saxons, etc. But then it focuses on the modern hot Chileans, cool Jamaicans, Dominicans, Trinidadian, mixed with Ethiopians, Chinese, Vietnamese, nationalities all over.
So the sources interpret this mixing and binding them together with English, not as harmonious integration, but as a deliberate attempt to supersede the native culture.
That's the critical takeaway presented in the source material, yeah. They point out that melting pot is an American concept, not historically British. They argue this rhetoric is imported wholesale and used for ethnic advantage. The conclusion drawn is that the design of this rhetoric further displaced the native British by reframing their national home as a land belonging to everyone, and therefore structurally to no one in particular.
This aggressive pro-immigration stand, it runs directly counter to overwhelming public sentiment, doesn't it?
Right.
Which provides the radical right with their most potent unifying argument.
Absolutely. The commentary notes the sentiment that immigration has gone far too far is exceptional. 70% of the public want it.
70.
Yeah. And the radical right argues that mass immigration, particularly the recent Boris wave of non-European immigrants, was brought in without public consent, specifically to suppress wages, benefiting only the super rich employer class.
What's the proposed solution from the anti-immigration right then, and how does it connect back to their economic argument?
The proposed solution is pretty straightforward. Stop the inflow immediately. Turn off the gravy train of welfare payments to foreigners, which, they claim, would save millions of pounds monthly, and allow the labor market to return to its natural equilibrium by restricting the supply of labor. They frame this as a non-invasive solution. If foreigners are no longer getting free money and benefits, they argue, many will. This allows wages for native workers to rise naturally without needing excessive government intervention or wealth compensation.
Okay, so now we arrive at the strategic synthesis. How does this all come together? The left is struggling because their cultural commitments clash fatally with the public mood.
Right. They're saddled with what the sources call these evil cultural arguments, the pro-woke, pro-foreigner stance, proven to be extremely unpopular, like we saw with Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah.
This structural weakness stops them capturing that nativist working-class vote, even if they had a popular economic...
That cultural burden is their insurmountable Achilles heel then. They can't just pivot away from mass immigration because the PWL, as defined, is morally committed to it.
Exactly, which leaves this massive strategic opening for the radical right, an opening the sources argue they absolutely must exploit.
The key, then, is to take the left's strongest economic pillar, that critique of privatization and foreign exploitation, and fuse it seamlessly with the popular anti-immigration nativist feeling.
The commentary explicitly details this winning platform. The radical right must agree privatization was wrong, especially for natural monopoly, water and rail, and for profitable assets like Royal Mail. Okay.
They should argue these services should return to public ownership. But, and this is strategic, not out of communist ideology, strictly to reduce taxes and the drain of funds, and stop exploitation by foreign states, like the German or Dutch state railways.
So the platform becomes, we'll solve the economic problems and the identity problems at the same time. A unified vision for national recovery.
Yes. The new platform advocates for property owners, a functional market, but it forcefully rejects what the sources call ideological capitalism, the kind that rigs the market via mass labor immigration just to benefit the super-rich employer class, hurting wages for everyone else.
This combination, economic justice fused with nativism, is presented as irresistible because the left simply cannot match.
Precise. The strategy is seen as powerful because the left, being morally committed to mass immigration, is automatically blocked from making this move. The right takes the left's only remaining popular economic pillar.
And because the left is culturally burdened, they can't defend themselves from the combined. Plus, by restricting the labor supply through immigration reduction, the right allows the market to return to a natural wages rise again, achieving the desired economic effect without resorting to the economically destructive taxes and wealth confiscation, the PWL.
So this positioning lets the radical right sound more reasonable, more nationally focused than the communist-leaning left, whose policies, like that 100% inheritance tax, would bankrupt the country and cause capital flight. It shifts the debate from pure ideology to rational national interest versus perceived ideological folly.
That is the core takeaway for the radical right, according to. They must show balance over rigid, purely free market ideology. Be pro-market where it makes sense, but vehemently anti-exploitation regarding natural monopolies and foreign. This combination is presented as the only way to achieve a victory that is both economically stabilizing and culturally unifying for that nativist majority.
What a profound and, frankly, alarming analysis of the UK political. We've really seen how the traditional two-party system is being described as dismantled.
Yeah.
Giving way to this clash of two new ideological extremes. The post-woke left, dedicated to what the sources call communist-leaning anti-capitalism and cultural transformation. And the radical right, dedicated to nativism, national sovereignty, poised to merge economic nationalism with social conservatism.
What's fascinating here, I think, is the sheer potential for authenticity and uncompromising viewpoint to actually triumph over the kind of bland consensus that dominated the last few decades.
Right.
The political shift isn't just about party names changing, it's about the rise of factions pushing policies that, until recently, were really on the fringes.
Yeah.
On one hand, you have figures proposing 100% inheritance tax, celebrating cultural colony.
Yeah.
On the other, figures proposing wielding dictatorial powers to destroy everything the establishment holds dear. The middle ground is just structurally gone.
It certainly promises an era of intense political drama, deep uncertainty, particularly if those electoral projections, we reviewed 390 seats for reform, 15% for labor, if they were to actually hold true.
Which raises an important final question for you, the listener, to consider as we close this deep.
Okay.
If the center really has collapsed, and the victory of either of these emerging factions means the utter destruction of the other side's system, and the source rhetoric certainly suggests that, is the UK heading for an era of fundamental instability, chaos fueled by deep ideological resentment? Or is this radical realignment actually a necessary, maybe painful reset, something that countries been putting off for decades?
The breakdown of consensus is always volatile, isn't it?
Always. And in this case, the stakes appear to be truly existential for the future identity and the future economic model of the entire nation.